Hey there, Mr. Reddit here. Welcome back to another episode of r/entitled Parent Stories. Our first story we'll be reading today, entitled Neighbors Refused to Turn Down Their Music, so I called the cops on them. After that, manager forces me to get a doctor's note despite it being illegal to do so, ends up regretting it. And after that, how I got my old boss back after 6 years of super illegal labor law practices. Now for every thumbs up this video gets, one Karen has to turn down her music. You'll never make me. So please smash that like button and subscribe and turn on notifications for new stories from Reddit every single day. Entitled Neighbors Refused to Turn Down Their Music, so I called the cops on them. So yesterday evening, my entitled neighbors had a birthday party because my country stats have gotten much better in these past few weeks. We live on a countryside. Lots of us have smaller farms, which is why we aren't really living close together. Now, as I said, my neighbors had a birthday party and played loud music, which honestly was nice to listen to, but once the clock was past midnight, the music became louder and I couldn't even fall asleep. Edit. My country has a law that no disturbance of night peace is allowed between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I had to get up before 5 today because I had some at-home visits on my schedule. I'm a veterinarian apprentice. Sorry for my English. And when it was almost 2 a.m., I called and texted my neighbor asking if there was a chance they could turn it down a bit. She answered that I live far enough that I shouldn't hear much, so I sent them a video where you can hear how loud their music was, and I was basically called a rude, old-fashioned, bitter jerk grandma. I'm 29, female, so I decided to call the cops. I was told I wasn't the only one who called and that they're already on their way, and today when I talked to my dad, he also called me bitter and said no wonder I have no friends, which really hurt me as I have a very busy life and so do my friends. So, am I the jerk for calling the cops because I wanted to sleep? Info, because I see some people talking about it. No, my dad was not at the party. He was at home. They have been doing this for the past few weeks. It's not all birthday parties, it's just plain weekend parties that are usually going on all night. I'm not the only one complaining. Their closest neighbors are parents with twin babies. They were the ones who called the police yesterday, besides myself. The mom is a good friend of my cousin. I had to give 2 injections today at my at-home visits. It's been rough preparing for this mentally, and honestly, a decent night's sleep is quite important to me. I'm not that old. I'm 29 with no kids at the moment, with a steady boyfriend and a group of friends I wouldn't trade for the world, and I like partying with them. I just can't imagine inconveniencing people and being noisy in a rather close neighborhood, as they have neighbors that are rather close to them. Our farm is much more secluded. Manager forces me to get a doctor's note despite it being illegal to do so. Ends up regretting it. When I was in my early 20s, I worked at a supermarket. I should note that I was a pretty reliable employee. I was never late. In fact, I often got in early, and I rarely called in sick. At the time this happened, I had not called in sick for 9 months, and even then, the manager had sent me home. I had been up all night, swinging between burning hot and freezing cold, so I was obviously feverish, and I had been throwing up at both ends, shall we say. At one point, at about 2 a.m., I was on the toilet, with my head in the sink, utterly miserable. I must have passed out, because the next thing I know, I was lifting my head off the sink, and it was 7 a.m. I was due to start work at 12 that day, but that obviously wasn't going to happen. So I called up the manager. Let's call the manager Steve. Steve was known for being a real jerk. He never believed anyone who called in sick except his best buds, usually other managers, never lowly staff, but often called in sick himself. A lot of the time we knew it was because he was hungover and not actually sick. The conversation went as follows. Me. Hey Steve, sorry, I can't come in. I'm sick. Steve. With what? Me. I don't know. I think it might be the flu. I've been up all night being sick and I have a fever. Steve. Don't be stupid. If you had the flu, you'd be completely knocked out. I need you in. Come in or you're fired. Me. I can't. I just told you I can't stop throwing up. I passed out. Steve, growling angrily. Either come in or bring a doctor's note or you're fired. In the UK, you are legally allowed to self-certify for 5 days. This means you can tell your employer you are sick and you do not need a doctor's note. If you're sick for more than 5 days, you then need a note. It is also illegal to demand a doctor's note during the self-certify period. I knew this, but I was terrified. This was during the recession. I couldn't afford to lose my job. So I got myself dressed, almost passed out trying to do so, then trudged to the doctor's some 25 minutes walk away. I end up sitting in the doctor's office for a little over an hour, which for walk-ins was pretty good. I get in to see the doctor, and she is furious at me for coming in. You're not supposed to come to the doctors when you are ill, and of course, I knew that I should have been able to self-certify. She told me as such, saying I shouldn't be here and should have stayed at home. I then explained what had happened with Steve and how he had threatened to fire me over this, and I couldn't afford to lose my job. I was struggling as it was. My doctor turned her anger towards my management. She asked if I got sick pay from the company, and I said yes. He wants a sick note, does he? The doctor says. Okay, I'll give him a sick note. Now, my manager just wanted a note confirming I was sick, but instead, my doctor wrote something along the lines of, OP has come to the hospital because manager has insisted she come in spite of the fact that this is illegal and all employees are allowed to self-certify. Due to being forced to make this unnecessary and highly dangerous trip when the patient is ill, has a fever of 39 degrees Celsius and almost passed out in the waiting room, I am signing OP off for 2 full weeks to recover. Had OP been allowed to self-certify, as is the law, they might only have needed a few days. But due to straining themselves, they now require 2 full weeks. They are not to be permitted to work until this date, 2 weeks later. The doctor said she would have signed me off longer, but this was the longest she could do without requiring further evidence. So basically, instead of just being off for a few days, I was now signed off for a full 2 weeks, and I'd be paid for it. I went to my place of work, at which point one of the duty managers saw me and asked me what the heck I was doing here. Go home. I was obviously very unwell. I explained what happened. They agreed to help me downstairs to Steve's office and went with me inside. I handed Steve the note. He looked worried and tried to say I wasn't being serious about firing you. Well, gee, when you angrily growled it down the phone, it sure sounded like it. The duty manager then declared that they were going to drive me home. It was clear Steve wanted to argue, but he had the sense that he knew he shouldn't. The duty manager then drove me home, made sure I was okay, then went back to work, where they informed our union rep of what had happened. Steve had a disciplinary hearing where he was given a severe reprimand and a warning. Steve tried to argue he never said I'd be fired, and I was lying and just decided to go to the doctors, but the duty manager said they had heard him admit to it when he said to me that he didn't really mean it. I felt better after a few days and enjoyed my 2 weeks off, fully paid, and enjoyed the nice weather we had. Meanwhile, Steve was forced to work overtime because we were short-staffed. So, thanks to the doctor, instead of being off for a few days, I ended up getting a nice 2-week paid vacation, and Steve was given a final warning, all because he insisted I get a doctor's note. How I got my old boss back after 6 years of super illegal labor law practices. This story is 6 years worth of illegal practices. It's super cathartic for me to write this, and I'm going to spare no expense on the dirt. I've now been out of the company long enough that I feel safe and secure enough to post about how I left my 6-year-long career at a famous chain sub shop. I've always posted stories about entitled customers and parents from there, but this one will be about my super entitled jerk boss and how I got my sweet revenge when I finally left the company. How it started. When I was 25, I was in a pretty weird situation where I needed a job and I could not afford to be picky about which one I got. I just happened to be in a local sub shop asking the manager if they were hiring, and the owner was there that day. He hired me on the spot and I started working the next day. Training went quick and I was working 40 hours a week and finally earning some money. My first red flag that something here was not exactly normal was the fact that the manager quit less than a month after I had been hired. She had asked for weekends off to be with her kids, and the owner told her no. She actually made a fully functional schedule that worked for everyone that gave her Saturdays off. He put her back to Wednesdays off, so she just walked out. I was promoted to manager within less than a month of training under me. But I was determined to stay with the job, and I was going to enjoy the dollar raise that came with it. So I taught myself how to do inventory and food orders. I taught myself how to make schedules and do all of the other things that a sub shop manager does. I actually got pretty good at it. After a year of doing it, I had expedited the inventory process and made it so functional the owner had me teach other managers that he hired at his other franchise locations. He owned 6 shops total. They were scattered all over the place, and 2 of them, one I worked at, were less than a mile from each other. He decided he wanted to have a monopoly in the city and bought the last sub shop in the area. He made me area manager and put me at the new location. Basically, my daily job was this: show up at 11 a.m. to relieve the store opener, make sure that everything was functioning, work until 7 p.m. when I would be relieved by the closer. Then I would drive to the other 2 locations to check and make sure everything was okay. Some days I would drive to location A in the morning before my shift started, and I would drive to location B after my shift started. On Tuesdays, I did inventories, and on Wednesdays, I did 3 stores worth of delivery orders. The store I was working at was slow enough that it technically only needed 1 person working at a time, with a little overlap during the lunch and dinner rush. It kind of sucked sometimes. If it got busy, you were doing it all on your own. You had to help customers during your lunch break, and you didn't technically get breaks. Going to the bathroom was a gamble. I still dread hearing that doorbell go off when I was midstream. At first, it was a perfectly reasonable job. I had the stores operating effectively. Everything was organized, inventory counts were very accurate, and there was very little shrink. Customers were happy. That lasted about 6 months before things started getting illegal. I think my boss was having some kind of personal/marriage problems and was taking it out on his staff. Both he and his wife came from super rich families, millionaires. I've been to their mansion one time for a birthday party. Indoor and outdoor pool, private movie theater, complete with bar and popcorn maker. They had cash to burn. The first illegal thing happened when our store got broken into. A thief broke the window with a rock and tried to find the cash box. As it was locked in the safe, he didn't get anything, but he did pry open the till drawer to find it empty. The police called me since my number was on the whiteboard marked as emergency contact. I showed up and took inventory and told the police the thief had stolen nothing. I even gave them video footage of the thief. A few days later, a cop came back and asked me to confirm how much had been stolen from the store. I told him $0. It turns out, my boss had reported a loss of $500 from the cash box. I'm not sure if he got fined for filing a false police report, but he showed up at work the next day and yelled at me. He told me, "You don't tell the cops anything unless I give you permission next time." Over the next couple of months, he also started becoming a penny pincher at all of his locations. He would jack up the price of the subs to the maximum amount he was allowed to by the franchise. He would skimp on the veggies and would yell at us if we put on the recommended amount. If the recipe called for 8 slices of turkey, he told us to put on 6, basically upsetting all of my regulars. It really hurt our business, which meant we were earning less, which made him more of a penny pincher. Things started breaking in the store, and he wouldn't hire professionals to fix them. He would bring in friends and pay them in beer. I remember his mechanic friend coming in to fix our freezer over 10 times in a year. It never properly kept the food at freezing temperatures and leaked water into the freezer. When health inspectors would come in, they would point it out, and my boss would say, "Yeah, I'm getting it fixed next week." I was so nervous getting frozen food out of the freezer that was basically 33 degrees all the time. Our frozen bread was floppy half the time. I dealt with this for multiple years. I know, I'm an idiot. I should have run away long ago, but I was literally living hand to mouth, and me and my husband were trying to keep a roof over our head. We were both working 60+ hours a week. We just didn't have our lives together enough to be picky. If I was going to leave that store, I would need to find a job that paid 1.5 times the minimum wage as a starter to make the same amount I was doing 60 hours a week as the area manager. It was when my boss started doing illegal labor law practices that I began seriously looking to leave. I handled faxing in the payroll at the end of every week. There's always a little star next to your clock in/clock out when the time has been altered. I'll fix if somebody forgets to clock in, forgets to clock out, etc. I started noticing that everybody's hours have been adjusted multiple times on multiple days. The boss was cutting people's hours back by half an hour plus. If the clock in started at 6, he would change it to 6:30. I pointed this out to him, and he used the excuse that they just stand around and waste time every shift, so I take that time away. He installed video cameras. He would literally watch them from home with a stopwatch and send me a text at the end of the day telling me to retract certain amounts of time off of everybody's shift. I told him no. If he wanted this done, he could do it himself. It was crazy illegal, and I wanted no part of it. I also discovered something one year when he was showing me how to do the year-end reports for tax filing. Even though the stores were a franchise and were all owned and operated by him and his wife, each individual store he had registered under a different business name and a different bank, i.e., you worked at store A and got a paycheck from Waldo & Sons LLC. And if you covered somebody's shift at store B the same week, you got a second paycheck from Waldo Inc., etc. I asked him why he did this, as it seemed incredibly unnecessary and complicated. He told me it was for tax purposes. He paid less taxes if he registered each store as its own individual franchise. I pointed out that this was illegal. He said he could get away with it by claiming that each store was owned by somebody else in his family, i.e., the store was owned by his wife, the store was in his name, this store was in his brother's name, etc. It was super shady. I had already been here 6 years dealing with this crap. I was fixing to leave very soon. I had enough saved up to cover bills for at least 3 months to give me time to find a new job. I kept telling him that if he pushed me too far, I would leave him high and dry with no area manager, and he would have to come all the way out to man the stores himself. He showed up to the stores maybe once a week. He mostly went to the stores closest to his house. He hated having to drive the hour-long drive from where he lived to my 3 stores way out in the boondocks. The day finally came where he pushed me to my breaking point. Inspectors of the franchise came monthly. They were technically required to find 3 things wrong at every location because nobody could be perfect. There was minor, moderate, and major errors that they could find. Major errors got the owner fined. I had only had 1 major error found between my 3 stores in the last 6 years there. But one day, the boss called, yelling at me because of a burnt-out light bulb in the oven. It was a minor error, but he laid into me like I had just gotten the store shut down. It was so bad, my mother and father heard him yelling at me on the phone speaker. My dad promised to cover my rent until I can find a new job. I just sat silently and let him yell. When it was over, I said, "Okay, I'll do better tomorrow," then hung up. That night, I stayed up super late finding all the phone numbers for L&I, OSHA, and all the legal resources I could find. The next day, I didn't go into work. I stayed home making phone calls. I still had texts from the boss telling me to adjust people's hours. I had recordings from our security cameras of him changing the dates on the prepped food so we didn't throw it away as soon. I even had 5 years plus worth of pay stubs from the 3 different business names owned by 3 different people, but all signed by him. L&I was incredibly interested to hear about the time clock adjustments. They happily accepted email copies of all of my text logs and several dozen pages of faxed pay stubs. I also learned that he should have been paying me overtime for working 20 hours extra each week. He told me I was salary, yet he classified my pay as hourly. I ended up speaking to a couple of different people about his fraudulent tax/money practices. Every single one of them wanted copies of my pay stubs and proof that they were owned by the same person. The best call I saved for last. A call to the local health inspector. I informed them about the leaky freezer, the changing of dates on prepped food, the disgusting practice of keeping food far past its expiration date. The temp log book showed that we literally just wrote down random numbers instead of actually taking the temperatures because it takes too long to do that every 2 hours. Or my personal favorite, the time a plumber was fixing the toilet and it literally exploded nasty water out into our lobby. The boss made us keep the store open and mop it up quickly, right in front of customers. The health inspector was very interested. All of these calls I did while getting dozens of angry voicemails and texts from my boss asking me where the heck I was. Since I was literally supposed to be working a shift and didn't show up, the poor opener had to stay late and the closer had to come in early. I felt a little bad about that, but I knew the next day the boss himself would have to come in to cover the shift unless he hired somebody and trained them overnight. I ignored every single one of his phone calls. I just never went back, not even for my last paycheck. I never heard back about getting all that unpaid overtime, but I did hear through the grapevine about the fallout of what happened the next few months. 2 of my boss's stores were completely shut down, as in health inspectors put a red warning label on the doors and gave him 1 month to fix all of the problems before they would let him open again. He lost his franchise rights with the company. He had to sell all of his stores to other franchisees. Since he was still paying back loans on a couple of them, he had to sell them at a loss. Almost every single one of his employees working for him at the time got huge payouts for the missing time that he had removed from their time clock. One former employee I met up with almost a year later told me that he had gotten a $5,000 check. He had only been there a year. I also learned that my boss got put on 2 years probation in lieu of prison time, and apparently he failed his first surprise drug test, so he ended up spending a couple of weeks behind bars anyway. I found out through social media that my boss's wife left him for a year to let him get his head put on right. And when they got back together, she made him be a stay-at-home dad while she went out and ran the stores that were still in her name. I know it's not as climatic as some pro-revenge stories on this site, but it felt so good to get revenge and let him sleep in the bed that he had made. I've got another job now, and I get paid the same amount that I was earning from him, but I only work 40 hours a week. I get actual lunch breaks now. I get overtime now. I actually didn't realize how illegal his practices had been until I started working a normal 9-to-5 job. To this day, the idea of taking a lunch break without having to help customers in the middle of it is just wonderful. Sorry for how long this story was, but I hope some people enjoy the absolute craziness that was my crazy boss. And now you all know why I will probably never eat at another chain/franchise sub shop again. Am I the jerk for telling my father-in-law what his wife has been saying about him on the internet? My wife's mom and stepdad separated about 18 months ago. From my understanding, the cause was that stepdad wanted to let his 2 adult kids move into their home after both of his kids lost their jobs due to lockdown and needed a place to stay. Mother-in-law was totally against this. At first, stepdad obeyed his wife's wishes, but he eventually heard his son was sleeping in his car after losing his apartment and told both of his kids that they could come. Mother-in-law was furious and would call my wife almost daily to complain about it. Mother-in-law and stepdad got into a big fight about it, and when stepdad told her that he wasn't going to kick his kids out and have them be homeless, mother-in-law left. Mother-in-law has been basically couch surfing ever since. She stayed with us for a few 2 to 3 week stints and has bounced around to her other siblings the rest of the time. Stepdad's daughter moved out late last year, but his son still stays with him and is trying to save up money to move out. Mother-in-law refuses to go back until stepdad's son is gone. At this point, stepdad and mother-in-law are no longer talking. I'm actually pretty close with stepdad as he helped me with numerous home projects after my wife and I bought our first house. He feels like he's stuck between a rock and a hard place because he loves mother-in-law and he wants her to come back, but he also doesn't want his son sleeping in his car again. Mother-in-law has told my wife and I that she refuses counseling because she doesn't think she's done anything wrong, and she won't file for divorce because she doesn't have a job and needs stepdad's income and health insurance. She also feels that stepdad won't file for divorce either because she knows he would feel guilty about cutting her off from insurance. Over the last year, mother-in-law has been posting a lot of stuff on Facebook about stepdad. A lot of bad-mouthing him, calling him names, saying mean things about his kids, and that the only thing stepdad is good for is money and health insurance. Stepdad doesn't have Facebook and doesn't know what mother-in-law has been saying about him. A few months ago, I was helping stepdad move an appliance, and he told me how much he missed mother-in-law and how much he wanted her to come back. I felt bad hearing how much he was hurting and told him that he needed to see something. I showed him mother-in-law's Facebook feed and all of the bad things that she's been saying. He broke down crying, but eventually pulled himself together enough to let me help him screenshot the posts and save them. A couple weeks ago, mother-in-law called my wife in hysterics because stepdad had actually filed for divorce. After they got done talking, my wife talked to me about it, and I came clean that I showed stepdad what mother-in-law has been saying about him online. My wife was irate about it and told me that it was none of my business to do that and that I shouldn't have meddled in their relationship. I told her stepdad deserved to know what mother-in-law was saying about him. My wife told me I'm being a huge jerk because if her mom finds out that it was me who told stepdad, then mother-in-law will never forgive me and it will cause a huge rift in her relationship with her mom. I sure hope his wife won't take after her mother. That wouldn't be good. So, you want strict adherence to the city bylaws? You got it, neighbor. This compliance is ongoing and will be for the foreseeable future. So I pulled out my gas-powered pressure washer this past weekend for the first time in 3 years. Figured it was well past time to do some property cleanup. Started at 11 a.m. on Saturday morning as I didn't want to start too early out of respect for my neighbors. Knocked off around 4 with a couple of breaks in between. Got the back and both sides of the house done. Lots of concrete patio. Figured I can finish the front driveway and retaining wall next day. Fired it up Sunday at 11 a.m. and got to work for an hour or so. Broke for lunch, then back at it at 1. Maybe an hour or so later, I'm interrupted by the city bylaw enforcement officer who is responding to a noise complaint. Apparently, there's a law that prohibits power equipment on Sundays. Okay, I had no idea. Just a warning, no ticket. The guy was actually very nice. I'm a bit annoyed that my neighbors called bylaw on me without at least coming to talk to me about it first, but okay. At this point, there's a huge mess all over the end of my driveway, the sidewalk and the street, so I asked the officer if it's okay quickly to take 5 minutes to clean up the mess and push it all together. He says sure, no problem, and I quickly start cleaning up. Cue not one, but two of my old guy neighbors to come running out of their houses to attack the poor bylaw kid. A minute later, he comes back and says, "Sorry, you need to shut it down now." Okay, he's just doing his job, but now I'm ticked. I've lived here for 8 years, and none of these old jerks have even said hello to me or my family. So I get the details of the exact bylaw. Nothing on Sunday. Saturday, 9 to 5. Should have started earlier. Monday to Friday, 7 to 7. As he's leaving, I call out very loudly to him, not really to him. "So, just so I'm clear, 7 a.m. Monday morning is okay?" Bright and early, at the stroke of 7 a.m. Monday morning, I put in an hour of pressure washing before going to work. Tuesday morning, another bright and early start. Wednesday's session was truly awesome. Who should stop by this morning while I was working on my retaining wall and sidewalk but my neighbor, Baldy McBylaw Caller. I gave him a friendly wave and a neighborly good morning and continued with my work until I ran out of gas. He hung around for a while, glaring unhappily at me, but must have realized that there was really nothing he could do about this situation he had caused. He slunk away a few minutes later. I'm running out of things to pressure wash, but my other neighbor has let me know I can borrow his grinder so I can finally get rid of that piece of rebar sticking out of the concrete at the side of my house. Sunday today, and tomorrow is a holiday, so I guess it will have to wait until Tuesday at 7 a.m. You want me to check if your new BS policies are legal? Sure. About 10 years ago, I had my first real job working in a fast food chain for minimum wage. It was a crappy job, but it was only to fill a gap between me dropping out of the 6th form in February and starting my college course in September. After being there several months, the regional manager came over to visit and talked about there being a few incidents regarding money missing from the tills that were never resolved. We're not exactly talking about the heist of the century here. It would be for a few pence, or at most 5 pounds, and this had only happened on a handful of occasions. Most were resolved to being mistaken orders on the tills or card receipts dropping behind the tills. Because of this, there was a new policy that they implemented where the staff members would each be personally responsible for their tills, meaning they required everybody to come in 15 minutes before their shift and stay 15 minutes after their shift to count the money in the tills. All of this time was unpaid. We were also told if the tills were short, we had to pay it back out of our own pockets on the same day, no exceptions. Of course, if the tills were up, they'd just call that a win for them and pocket the extra cash. The staff always lose. Naturally, everybody was ticked off about this, except for one jerk who said it was great that people have to take responsibility for their mistakes. I guess unpaid overtime will teach us a lesson, right? I'm usually very quiet and introverted, but I will absolutely speak out for something I truly believe in, or protest against something I don't. I was first to speak out against these new policies and question their legalities, to which the area manager responded with something along the lines of, "Feel free to check their legality. I assure you that we aren't breaking any laws." So I did exactly that. Later that night, I went home and checked our laws, and unsurprisingly, everything they were enforcing was illegal here. The area manager is based in Ireland, which more than likely has different employment laws, but his ignorance to our different laws and situation was painfully obvious. I called up the equivalent of a union. They don't exist here either, and they confirmed that it was illegal and advised me not to adhere to the policies. Next shift comes around and I roll in at 11 a.m., my start time, and immediately the other staff start kicking off. I went upstairs, counted my float and the 15 minutes they expected it to take, and then actually started working at 11:15. I explained myself to the rest of the staff and showed them evidence, and they all decided to follow suit. Everybody except for the jerk. She insisted that we all needed to do our part for the company that pays us minimum wage, don't forget, and that we should be grateful for the jobs. Still minimum wage. None of us took that on board and left her to carry on working for free if that's her choice. I think she was expecting something from the boss for her dedication. The local manager was also on our side, but he did have to tell the regional manager what was happening. On the regional manager's next visit about a month later, he started having meetings with the staff to investigate what this was all about and why we weren't sticking to the policy, and they all pointed towards me telling them not to. When he got around to the meeting with me, he was ticked and started kicking off at me and asking why I was so determined to overrule him, to which I replied, "You told me to check the legalities of the policy, so I did," and showed him the evidence in the form of our local employment laws on my phone. Defeated, he left to withdraw all the policies including the ones where we had to waste time counting the floats and pay back any shortages. The rest of the staff there liked me for it, except the jerk, but nobody liked her anyway. Am I the jerk for telling my surrogate to stop acting like she was my husband's wife? My husband and I have been together for 5 years. We wanted kids, but because of my health problems, this wasn't possible. We decided to go with surrogacy. My friend nominated her sister, Brittany, who's 29. I agreed right away because I know Brittany and the family. We've set everything up, discussed payment, short and long-term plans, counseling, and doctor's appointments. We've explored IVF and chose a private clinic to get it done. It started after Brittany took a pregnancy test. She only told my husband, though she had both our numbers. She only sent my husband a pic of the test while he was at work and sent me nothing when I gave her my personal contact info, but it was okay. Things got complicated when Brittany started having access to our credit cards for her own wants and claims that they were for the baby's needs. She's excluded me from doctor's visits and scans and had only my husband go with her. Her excuse was my husband drives and has time since I work and am unavailable most of the time. I felt isolated from this experience but said nothing, knowing she's bearing a lot of burden, so I had patience. My husband had no idea what was going on and if this was normal. This was new to us, so we didn't know. She's 7 months in, and last week she had us visit to discuss things that I thought we'd previously agreed on, but she said she changed her mind about, and her mom was there too. I heard Brittany out and was shocked when she gave us a list of how things should be from now on, since she said there was a lot of confusion in the past because of me stressing her out by complaining. She requested she gets a say in things like baby's name after I deleted the list of names she sent to my husband. She wanted more access to my husband's credit cards and free time to get stuff done at her place. Also, more time with the baby than agreed on. Then wrapped up by saying only my husband should be with her in the delivery room and use the hospital as an excuse. I got up and firmly stated I don't agree on her new terms and that she had to stop acting like she was my husband's wife and this was their baby. My husband didn't speak till she started crying. He asked me to sit down, but I said I had boundaries, reminded her what her role was and how she had overstepped. Her mom went off and said her daughter was being mistreated when she put herself mentally and physically through the most selfless act for us to make us a family. She gave up a part of her life these months to give us what we want, and I was acting selfish and ungrateful. She had us leave, then told my friend, and it got more complicated. I was told to apologize for what I said. Am I the jerk?
Click this button to join as a member today and we'll give you a shout out in our next video.
Or come watch this video next. It's one of the craziest ones we've ever done.